Hello and welcome to the Point Blank Show. My name is Abhishek. My guest today is Samanth Subramanian, an award-winning journalist who writes for The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Wired, The Guardian, 1843, among many other publications. He has also authored several books, and his latest one is called The Web Beneath the Waves, a story of the fragile cables that connect our world, unquote. The Economist ranked it as among the best books of 2025. Hi, Samanth. Thanks very much for joining in.
Thank you so much for having me, Abhishek. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. In the first few pages, very often we just merely skim through the dedication, or the book is dedicated, in this case, for Vedant and Shravan, who grew up never knowing a world without the internet. And I've got a 7-year-old, and both of us have lived in an era where we may have studied under candlelight if the lights go off, or maybe we would have enjoyed the fact that there was no, we keep our books aside. But today, with AI, among other things, we take some of these things for granted, which is the internet connection that come along with it. Now, one of the things that I was fascinated with is, or maybe I was wrong, forgive my ignorance, I credited the satellites for the magic that happens on Earth. But your book clearly reveals otherwise. When did you start becoming interested in undersea cables of all things?
Well, I mean, there's a long and short story to this. The long story is, this was around 2014, 2013, maybe even 2012, something like that. I was at home in Delhi. I just acquired an iPhone. It was an iPhone 3G, so maybe it was 2011. And I was, we used to have this app back then called Instapaper, which many people might remember. You can download these long articles and save them to your phone, read them at your leisure, kind of like Pocket, but with a better interface. So I downloaded, among many other articles, this one piece called Mother Earth, Motherboard by the science fiction writer Neil Stephenson. And I'd never heard of the book before, the essay before, but it turned out to be 40,000 words long. It had formed, back when it was published in Wired magazine in the 90s, it had formed almost all of the issue in which it was published. It was like basically dedicated to this essay. And it was, this piece by this acclaimed science fiction writer who I had read. And he kind of fashions himself as what he calls a hacker tourist. And he goes around the world looking at where cables emerge, looking at where cables go down into the ocean, but also transit over land. He looks at cable switching stations. He looks at the people who lay and repair these cables. And he kind of envisions, the title Mother Earth, Motherboard envisions the entire surface of the planet as a motherboard with these kind of wires forming the circuitry, so to speak. And that essay for me was very fascinating and eye-opening. I kind of knew notionally that there were cables out there and that they carried our data traffic. But the fact that I was able to, for example, be on my phone, walk to the grocery store, still reading the piece, walk back from the grocery store, still reading the piece, it revealed to me that this connectivity that I was taking for granted was actually due to these cables that lay under the ocean's surface. And so at that point, I remember getting very kind of intrigued by it, but then really not acting on it much until a few years ago when I read more about this earthquake off the coast of Tonga, undersea earthquake that had then kind of triggered a volcanic eruption that then cut the one international data cable going out to Tonga. And that fascinated me because I thought, we'd just come out of the pandemic. We were more reliant than ever on the internet. And it struck me that this, for the first time, was an economy and a society and a country that was entirely taken off the international grid, the internet, so to speak. They had no forms of communication. They had no phone calls except for some satellite phones that they managed to jugaad eventually. They had no kind of regular e-commerce. They had nothing. They had nothing to connect them to the rest of the world. And I started to wonder, I remembered Neil Stephenson's essay and I wondered, what is that like, for starters? But also, like, between the time this Wired piece was published and the Tonga undersea volcano eruption, what has changed in the cabling of the internet? Who are the new players? Who are the old players? Do some things still stay the same? And, this infrastructure is now vital, much more so than it was in the 90s, to our economic interests and our livelihoods and so on. So what is there to kind of safeguard it? And how vulnerable is it? These are the questions that started coming to me. And then I got the chance to research them as a part of this small book. And I got the chance to answer them for myself and for you and many others.
It's quite interesting. And I was also surprised, and I shouldn't have been, I guess I should have done my reading, is that some of the things have remained the same for about a century. You write about cable and wireless.
Yeah.
the outfit, which was the pioneer back in the day. And my only recollection of that is when India and West Indies would play, Cable and Wireless would sponsor some of
Mm.
those series in cricket. Tell us a bit about the history. Where did it start? And what was the original, objective of having some of these cables for telegraph? Was it?
It must, yeah. I mean, the original cables, undersea cables were laid in the 1850s. There was one across the English Channel. There was one from England to the east coast of America. Eventually, 20 years later, there was a big long cable laid through the Suez to Bombay. And these cables is kind of, if you look at their map, the map of the cables from that time, it's quite clear that these cables are there, of course, as an exercise in communication, but also as a way for empires to control their far-flung territories. So the UK sits in northwestern Europe, but it has colonies in Asia and Africa and so on, and it needs a way for communication to be quite fast so that this control is exerted ever more powerfully, because by that time the economic interests of having these colonies were huge. So that was one reason the cable was laid. And then, of course, I mentioned this in the book, is that these cables were laid not only to control empire, they were also constituted by empire in one sense. And what I mean is that, back in the day when these cables were laid, telegraph cables had a core of copper or some other metal, mostly copper. But then around it was a kind of insulation that you had to wrap around before it could then be laid at the bottom of the sea. And that insulation was made from a kind of latex called gutta percha that was only tapped at the time from the plantations, the colonial plantations in Malaysia. So you can see how you get the raw material for these cables, in a sense, from the empire. And then you kind of make this cable that then goes back into controlling those very same far-flung territories that the Gutta Percha came from.
And in terms of how important they were even at the time, I think, was it during the Second World War where you make a brief mention about how they tried to save some part of it from bombers?
Yeah, I mean, there was at the time, as today, there were a lot of undersea telegraph cables that land in Cornwall in southwestern England. So if you go to Cornwall, you'll see these glorious beaches, sandy beaches, perfect for landing a cable. And this infrastructure was so important that they were perennially worried that the Germans would come offshore and just cut the cables and disappear. And so they erected kind of like fire, flame barriers and all this other kind of defensive mechanism just to preserve the cables. Now, of course, the Germans could always cut it further out at sea, but you had to kind of do what you could. And so they would erect these
Right.
defensive mechanisms closer to shore.
Hmm.
But the British themselves had been responsible for cutting German cables in the past. So this, the idea, and maybe we'll talk about this a little later in the conversation, but the idea that you can wage a kind of economic warfare or even military warfare by cutting the cables of an enemy is not new.
And today, as we speak, 99% of the world's intercontinental traffic is controlled by these cables. And I think there are some 1.4 million kilometers in total where these cables are, laid underneath. Can you give a bit of a perspective of what we are looking at in terms of size itself?
Yeah. So the correct figure is 95% of all international data traffic goes through these
Wow.
undersea cables. There are between 500 and 550 such cables. Some of them are, just a couple of dozen miles long. The others stretch from the UK all the way around to Portugal, around the coast of Africa, to the Middle East and to India. That's the longest one, called To Africa. If you total up the lengths of all of these cables, it approaches, as you said, close to 1 million miles. So, as you said, 1.4 kilometers, 1.4 million kilometers or so. And you mentioned satellites early on, and this misconception that we have that our data traffic is basically all funneled through satellite. And I think it's interesting that this is really a relic of lexicon, sort of the words we use in our day-to-day lives that makes us think this. So, for example, we use Wi-Fi, which is wireless. We think of cellular phones and mobile telephony and so on and so forth, cloud computing, and everything seems sort of very abstracted and up in the air, intangible, immaterial. But the truth is that you couldn't fill Earth's orbit with enough satellites right now to cater to the volume of data that we consume collectively as a species. And it's not just video calls and recordings like this one. It's not just emails and WhatsApps, although it is that also, but it's everything. It's documents we store on the cloud, day trading, healthcare databases, security databases, every single thing. There's so many aspects of our lives these days that are heavily networked that we don't even realize it. And it's only when something happens, as in Tonga, that you really see the extent of, the damage that a cable cut can do.
How easy is it to cut a cable? Can you describe the anatomy of a cable?
Yeah,
What exactly is it for somebody who hasn't seen it?
right. So the very, very basic cable is quite thin. I mean, the elemental part of it is these fiber optic fibers. Optic fiber is around the thickness of a human hair. So you might put, a few what they call fiber pairs of those. You might bunch them together and put them into a cable. And then in its most basic form, the cable has insulation and it has a thin sheet of metal to conduct some electricity so you can keep boosting the signal. And that's it. And that thickness it's as thick as a garden hose, if you think about the hose that you use to water your plants. Now,
Hmm.
when you go out to deep sea, to the deep ocean, that's what this cable looks like. So it's very easy to cut if you can find it. And indeed, it gets cut quite often. There might be a landslide in the ocean, or there might be a rock that just kind of tumbles down. On the rare occasion, sharks have bitten through it and kind of damaged cables that way. But by and large, in the deep ocean is where it's safest, because the deep ocean is a pretty big place. You can survey it, and ships don't anchor there. There's no kind of bottom trawling of the seabed by fishing boats and so on. As you come closer to shore, these other phenomena start to kick in, which is a ship might throw an anchor overboard accidentally or on purpose, and it might damage a cable. A fishing boat might trawl the seabed, that might damage a cable. And so as it gets closer to shore, you have to start protecting it more and more. So you kind of insulate, you put layers of steel around it. It comes a little closer to shore. It's double armored, as they call it. Then very, very close to shore, they put it into a duct that is dug into the seabed, and it comes out literally onto the beach in what is called a sort of beach manhole, literally.
Hmm.
And it comes up into that beach manhole and is then kind of threaded through to the landing station. And that's where it's kind of hooked up to the internet infrastructure, which includes servers and ways in which to distribute bandwidth and so on.
And you briefly, a couple of minutes ago, talked about the longest one, which is around 28,000 kilometers, if I remember that correctly from your book. And you went there, you spoke to a few people who were responsible for laying that. What are some of the challenges, or what is the long checklist that one needs to go through to to get your head around such a big project?
I mean, it's impossible to be comprehensive, I think, even on a longer call than this one. But I can give you a sense of the process. So basically, the process is, a company or companies that decide they want to finance and lay a cable will first need to figure out what their route is. And to figure out the route, they need to know where to land the cables, which countries along the way they will land the cable in. And you need a whole host of permitting exercises in each of those countries. Each country has its own rules and regulations. And there are increasingly, with every passing year, there are more and more environmental and ecological regulations for how to bring the cable on shore, where it can land, and so on. So you need a very big permitting department that is familiar with the rules in each of these countries. Then you need a very standard seafloor mapping exercise, so that there'll be ships that go out there and take the route that the cable is supposed to take, and they will map the seafloor, and they will kind of see which places to avoid, which is the most geologically stable route through which to drag this cable. If it comes closer to shore, sort of what are the hazards over there, that kind of thing. So the entire seafloor is mapped in this way. Then you go out, the companies will go out and order the cables, and the cable is made to specification. There's a long waiting list in all of these companies that make the cables, because there aren't many of them. And then you kind of load that cable onto a ship, a cable laying ship, and that starts its very slow progress through the route that has been mapped out. There is one company in the world that basically codes the software that is aboard all of these ships that determines how fast the ship should go, how quickly the cable should be paid
Hmm.
out, or the angle at which the cable should go down. It correlates the speed of the ship with the speed of the ocean and with the seafloor mapping exercise that has been done earlier. And it tells the ship essentially the best way in which to lay this cable. And so that is a firm based out of Hawaii. And so all these ships load this software on, and they kind of go very slowly, very, very slowly, and lay this cable. And then after that, of course, there's like the elaborate process of bringing the cable ashore in separate countries. Eventually, then there'll be a lot of testing. And finally, after many, many years, the cable will be switched on and ready for service.
And there was a time when you talked about the empire. It being in its interest to have these telegraph cables once upon a time. Who are those kingpins today? Is it the governments? Is it the tech giants? In whose interest is it to ensure that all of this is in place so that they can make money in the future, maybe, or influence?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, because the company or the entities that are responsible for laying and funding these cables, those have changed quite a bit. So in the 90s, it used to be state-owned communications departments. So BSNL in India would be an equivalent. But then at some point in the late 90s, early
Hmm.
2000s, private investors started to come in. So as an investor, I would come in, raise money from other people, get the project off the ground, and then sell bandwidth to companies in countries and try to recoup my money. Now, what is happening more and more for about, I would say, the past 5 years or 7 years is that the biggest funders and owners of these cables are increasingly what the industry calls OTTs, and that is the four big American tech giants: Microsoft, Meta, Google, and Amazon. And these are the companies. When I was researching this book, 2 out of every 3 new cables were being laid by these companies, and you can kind of see how it makes sense for them because data is essentially the lifeblood of their business. And it is in their best interests to have as smooth and as capacious a flow of data around the world as possible. The cables, cost a lot to you and me. A cable across the Atlantic right now costs about $500 million. I don't know about you, I can't afford it. But, Google and Meta and Amazon and so on, that's not a big amount for them. So they can afford to splurge this kind of money and make and fund these cables. So increasingly, that is sort of where the industry's cable laying energies are coming from. But it has to be said, when you asked about, you used a very interesting word, which is in whose interests is it that these
Hmm.
cables get laid and that they get maintained? But the answer to that is it's in all our interests. I mean, I think, by which I mean governments, but also citizens, because I think for better or for worse, it's really some kind of economic self exile to decide as a country that you don't really care about the internet and you don't want to kind of be as online as possible. The internet is a backbone, I think, of like most economies these days, and certainly of the world economy. And so for that economy to function and for your citizens to have this kind of livelihood that is dependent on the internet, it's in their best interests to make sure that the internet is accessible and cheap and safe and free.
And once you get used to it, any disruption to the internet is, I think there would be withdrawal symptoms if there were a equivalent to getting yourself off a drug, for instance. Because I think it was in 2024 where you write about it in the book as well, that Ghana's stock exchange had to close at least an hour before
Yeah.
the regular time, and this was during where there was some undersea cables that had severed in Africa because of some seismic activity down there. So when something goes wrong, how easy or difficult is it to repair, first of all, to diagnose such a thing and then go about repairing it? How does that whole process work?
Well, diagnosis has become easier and easier right now. I mean, I think like now the technology is at a point where as soon as a cable is cut somewhere, you
Hmm.
can send out a signal from one of the landing stations and you can kind of see where the break is. You can see approximately where the broken end of the cable will lie. It's not an
Hmm.
exact geolocation, but it's close. And so you can then like sort of immediately call for help and ask a cable repair ship to go out there and repair it. Now, that's where the easy part ends in one sense. The hard part is for the cable, there's not enough cable repair ships around the world. So sometimes countries have to wait in line for the ship to
Hmm.
become free before it then comes to attend to your work. A ship will then come to sort of where approximately the cable is, but from there, the process of figuring out where the cable is so you can lift it up to the surface and repair it is delightfully Victorian. I mean, it's pretty much the same as the ships used to do with telegraph cables in the 19th century, which is you throw a grapnel hook overboard and you drag it along the
Hmm.
seafloor where you think approximately the cable is. And if you're lucky, you snag it quite quickly. If you're unlucky, you'll snag a whole bunch of other things and bring them up to the surface, realize that's not it, put that back down, and then eventually snag the right one. Then you have to do this delicate sort of surgical procedure of repairing the cable on a ship on moving water, and then kind of lay it gently back down onto the seafloor. So all of that stuff is very technologically it's sensitive and advanced work.
There aren't too many of these repair ships. Your book suggests that there are around 69, which is awfully low, isn't it? For a project of this magnitude where you've so many tens of thousands of kilometers of undersea cables.
Yeah. I mean, I think like also a lot of these ships are already engaged in cable laying work. So you have to understand that cable laying
Hmm.
projects go on for months. So once, a ship has started in, I don't know, January of 2026, laying a cable somewhere and it's a reasonably long cable, it'll be out of commission for, 2 or 3 months. It won't be free to take on cable repair work. It'll load a bunch of cable onto its spool, this big circular spool on its deck, and then it'll sail out. It'll finish laying that cable, then it'll come back and pick up more cable, and so
Hmm.
on and so forth. So it's a very arduous and time-consuming process. The ocean is a big place, so even if you see on the on sort of your services that there are cable repair ships free in the South Pacific, it's not easy or practical to summon them all the way over to the west coast of Africa, for example, to repair a cable. So what the industry does is they've divided the world up into zones, and each zone has a kind of contract with a particular company to have a cable repair ship, just one, usually forever, just in those waters, patrolling those waters. And if there's an emergency, you can kind of call that ship to attend to your work. But as I said, it's just one ship per zone. There may be 2 or 3 breaks, and it takes some time before the ship can attend to its previous work, then come to repair your work,
Hmm.
repair your cable, drag it up to the surface, fix it, put it back down, test it. All of this takes time. It's part of the revelations for me with this book, and we're seeing this interestingly now with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz in a different way. But basically, part of the revelation for me is just how much our highly digital abstract world still moves at the speed of physics. You can't speed up
Hmm.
how long it takes to kind of sync two glass fibers together. You can't speed up beyond a certain point how long it takes for a ship to get out to a broken cable spot, or, sort
Hmm.
of how long it takes to drag a grapnel along the seabed to find the cable. So a lot of this is still, very much down to the limited speed of molecules and atoms, which I find kind of a little reassuring, although, of course, in emergency situations, that's actually quite distressing to a lot of people as well.
You can't even throw money at the problem, right? It's not like you get some ship here ASAP. You can't do any of that.
Absolutely.
Although I think it was it the Pentagon which in 2021 they had something called a cable security fleet. Apparently they said that they'll pay some $5 million is what the Economist says too, as an annual stipend in exchange for being on 24 hours notice in case there is a crisis. Somebody, but I don't know how it might work. How does a ship actually come there within 24 hours? But at least a few things get rolling once they
That's
get the
right.
news is what I understand.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But also, you have to remember the American military and probably a few other militaries around the world have their own sort of undersea cables. These are not, civilian traffic doesn't flow along these cables.
Hmm.
And so, for them, it's a national security issue, and it's worth paying five million a year to a ship owned by Subcom, I think, which is the American company, to just have it be on call.
Hmm.
It's like your emergency doctor. So the minute you page them, they have to come drop dinner and come rushing to the hospital. But even that, there's only a certain amount of money you can throw at it before the laws of physics kick in again. So if the break is in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and there's been a sort of geological event and the cable is buried under sediment or rock, no amount of money thrown at that ship will expedite the actual finding of the cable and its excavation and bringing it up to the surface and its repair.
And how has it been in the recent, let's say, 10 years or so? Accidents versus deliberate acts of sabotage. What's the ratio like? And have countries genuinely gone ahead and used this, trying to disrupt undersea cables to gain some sort of an advantage over others?
I mean, the ratio, I think, is still heavily lopsided in favor of accidents. So I think there are about roughly, give or take, 100 breaks every year. And most of these are accidents, ship anchors, fishing trawlers, that kind of thing. But I think the number of deliberate acts of damage is going up slowly. And even if it isn't going up, I think it's interesting that a lot of the people in the industry, a lot of the people in government seem to be apprehensive that it will go up, that these cables are a very
Hmm.
natural kind of vulnerability, or sort of a national security hazard or an economic hazard, and they have to be protected more and more. And I think, definitely from the conversations I've had, there are a number of people in governments around the world who think that these deliberate acts of damage have already happened. They're difficult to pin down. Oh, it's very hard to say, for example, that a fishing boat did this on purpose, that it's actually acting
Hmm.
at the behest of, for example, the Russian government. It'll involve enormous prosecution and investigation before that can be ascertained. But certainly governments are paranoid enough about it now that they have, the UK, for example, has 2 naval vessels permanently patrolling British waters to make sure that its undersea infrastructure is safe. The Baltic nations, the Scandinavian nations, they have Coast Guard patrols now in the North Sea and the Baltic Sea to make sure that cable infrastructure and pipeline infrastructure is safe from the Russians. The Taiwanese are very paranoid about the fact that the Chinese may cut some or all of the 15 cables that come to land in Taiwan. They suspect this may already have happened, and so they are extra careful and extra vigilant. So I think it's definitely the case that over the last 10 years, as you said, there is a heightened awareness of the fact that this is a very real possibility and that may already be happening.
And can one do anything about it? Like, for example, in space, this concept of space debris, it was debated for a number of years. Whom does that space debris belong to? Which country should take the, onus of cleaning it up, or among other things, because the jurisdiction was not known.
Yeah.
Is that very clear when it comes to these undersea cables? Because they span different countries. Does one country own it, or how does that piece work? Law perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when it comes close to shore in territorial waters, sometimes the jurisdictions are quite clear where you can prosecute and so on. But,
Huh.
one of the things I mentioned in this book is that it's very hard to think about, let's say, a cable which is owned jointly by 3 or 4 companies from around the world: American,
Huh.
British, French, Spanish, let's say. It is, out there in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So that, it's in international waters. The company, the ship that cuts it on purpose, let's assume, is captained by a Swedish guy, but flagged in Liberia, but also crewed by Indians and Filipinos, is, as I said, flagged in Liberia, but maybe owned by somebody in Japan. Where do you prosecute? Who do you prosecute? Which country's sort of, rule of law will apply here at all? Now, of course, I mean, there's some of this is laid down in the paperwork when the cable is laid, is laid in the first instance, where they say any disputes arising from this will be adjudicated in an American court of law. Let's say that. I'm sure that's part of a lot of these contractual agreements, but it's very hard to have that American court of law, its verdict or its judgment to apply to people who don't live there and to companies that aren't based there. To make matters worse, I mean, this one international framework that applies to the sea called the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. UNCLOS is very loose and quite unenforced. And, the United States, which is a perennial sort of abstainer from international treaties, has also refused to sign and ratify this one. So, the country from which the world's biggest cable layers and tech giants come, that country is not a party to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So these problems of jurisdiction are quite acute, and it's very similar to what happens in outer space, I think, which is that even if you put together a loose framework, enforceability is another thing altogether.
On one side, there is a law and enforcing the law. On the other side, technology itself. Are these undersea cables getting, is it getting more difficult for them to break? Are they the same over the years in terms of technology? I mean, if somebody has to really cut them, I can understand that might happen. But is there any way where things under the ocean are getting either safer or stronger as compared to, let's say, 20 years ago?
Well, I mean, I think closer to shore, things are definitely getting more protected. But if you go out into the deep ocean, I think the level of protection is pretty much the same. And there's a very good reason for this, which is that if you're laying hundreds or thousands of miles of deep ocean cable, the cable can only be up to a certain weight and a certain thickness. Before, if you cross that weight and thickness, it starts to become really economically unfeasible for a ship to carry heavy cable of that kind and go out into the ocean and lay this cable. You'll, instead of carrying, I don't know, let's assume for the sake of argument here, instead of carrying 1,000 miles of cable at one go, you'll be able to carry 100 miles because it weighs the same. You have to keep coming back to port, load another 100 miles. This project just becomes endlessly complicated and expensive. So for that reason, this cable out in the deep ocean has remained pretty much the same in terms of protection for a long time. What has happened, I will say, is that companies and countries have gotten a lot better at building redundancy into these cable systems. So I mentioned earlier that there are about 100 cable breaks around the world every year. Most of them are accidental. You and I have to be honest. I mean, we don't experience outages that are drastic, that many times a year at all, or even once a year. If we do ever experience an internet outage, it's mostly because, Cloudflare is down or something like that. There's some kind of like security company that has kind of spilled the beans rather than an actual physical cut in a cable. Yes, the redundancy of these networks is quite astonishing. So, in the sense that even if one cable does get cut, the traffic can be rerouted quite quickly and seamlessly to another cable or another cable system, and we won't experience any kind of loss of traffic use or anything like that. So, I think that is sort of what companies and countries are focused on, rather than thinking that the thing to do is just to beef up the armoring around the cable in deep sea.
And when these extraordinary events that take place, like the time that we are recording is when America and Iran are going at each other, and there are neighboring countries as well. Does any of that keep the custodians of these undersea cables up at night, that, hey, we got to keep one eye there, who knows what might happen?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of cables that go through the Strait of Hormuz. It's sort of, as it is a choke point with oil, it is also a choke point with data. So much for data as a new oil. There are a lot of data centers clustered around that area. I think Amazon and Microsoft definitely each have data centers of their own, and they rely on these cables to stay up and running. So I think definitely there's a lot of people who kind of flag this concern again and again. And in fact, a couple of years ago, there was a very similar concern raised about the fact that the Houthis in Yemen would try to cut, or had perhaps already cut, some cables in the Red Sea area. And I don't think anybody ever ascertained one way or another that they were responsible. So I should say that up front. But there were definitely cable outages at the time over there in a cluster that made it difficult to believe that it was sort of accidental. So I think
Hmm.
people are certainly worried. I mean, as they are worried with shipments of oil and natural gas and helium and so on, they are also worried about the potential for a sort of cascading effect of damage when a bunch of cables are cut at once, which basically breaks that trunk of cabling between Asia and Europe.
Yeah, that Houthis example, I was reading an article in the Economist which said that they bombed a cargo ship whose anchor apparently dragged along the bed, and it may have broken.
Right.
That may have been the cause, but there is no way of knowing whether that was a deliberate act of sabotage something. Yeah, and
Yeah,
that's
it was
where
a
you
bit of
said
that.
it's difficult to tell the difference between the two.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of this is now, put down to what is known as gray zone warfare. And what they mean by gray zone warfare is it happens when countries are not openly at war with each other. Now, US and Iran are openly at war, but let's say, Russia and Norway are not openly at war with each other right now. But it is entirely conceivable that the Russian government will ask or sort of deck up one of its naval vessels to look like a fishing trawler, to go out there and kind of drag their trawling apparatus around the seabed and cut cables on purpose. Now, you can't ascertain with entire confidence that that is a Russian naval vessel
Hmm.
or that it has been given these explicit instructions by the Russian government. You can surmise, but the uncertainty of all of this, the ambiguity of all of this is why, I like this term gray zone warfare quite a bit, because I think it really signifies, it captures the fact that much of what happens in our world today is happening in these kind of liminal zones of friction and conflict.
Another thing that I like, you said gray zone warfare. One acronym from your book that I liked was SHARP, SHARP. Can you tell us what that is, and how did you get to meet that person as well?
Well, I mean, one of the people I spoke to who gave me a lot of information and advice for this book was a guy called Rick Perry, who's had a long, long career in the telecommunications industry. He was with cable and wireless very long ago. Cable and wireless then became sort of privatized and so on. And he's now with Vodafone. So it's been a long career. So when to Africa, the cable system was being laid, and Vodafone was one of the partners. One of the companies involved in facilitating this cable network, they named a couple of fiber pairs after Rick Perry. So system honoring the achievements of Rick Perry, or Sharp, was basically the name given to this system. And Rick was delighted by this and kind of embarrassed and abashed and honored all at once.
Amazing. And what is it as a journalist? I think one of the joys of digging deep, in this case, figuratively as well, to in places where other journalists may not have. It's your story, it's your book. What is among the more exciting parts of your job as a journalist for doing this kind of book as well?
I mean, one thing often that I can definitely say is that there will be parts of my job when I'm out in the field and I'm in a place that I know, 99.9999% of the world will never visit. And that always kind of gives me a thrill, and I have to kind of pinch myself to remind myself that I'm lucky and honored and privileged to
Hmm.
do this job and to be able to go to these places. So for this book, for example, there were all these landing stations that every time I went in, particularly the one in Tonga, which Tonga by itself is a place that most of the world doesn't go to. To sort of walk along the beach in Tonga and go into a landing station where all this, essentially the internet is distributed to the archipelago, is fascinating. In other stories, I've gone down to a nuclear waste facility, a storage facility in Finland that is a half a kilometer below the earth. I've gone to subterranean oil caverns off the coast of Singapore. I've attended boxing matches in Hong Kong where investment bankers have hit each other trying to sort of, come out on top. So there's a lot of these things that I go to that I'm really thrilled to be there. But more than that,
Hmm.
even I think is the ability to call anybody, and ask them for an interview and say, listen, I want like 2 hours of your time or a day of your time. I want to sit down with you and I want you to tell me the story of your life. And I can ask
Yeah.
questions, any question, and these guys will tell me because I'm a journalist and this is what journalists do.
Yeah.
And the ability to listen to these stories and ask these questions and meet these people like Rick Perry, actually. I mean, somebody who has spent much longer than I've been alive. He has been in this industry, accumulating experience and wisdom. And I'm in a position to just have him tell me all of this stuff over a table or over a beer. And I think that's really fascinating and lucky.
And they would also be wondering who's this crazy guy who wants to know everything about things that only physicists or deep some technicians would like to understand, perhaps. Because another challenge is to make it user friendly so that people at large can read and make sense. It's a slim book, all right, but you would have had to keep many things out away so that you don't make it a very dry and a boring read, especially when the subject is so technical.
I think that's right. I mean, yeah, with any story, but particularly with this one, I think the objective is always to humanize the story as much as
Hmm.
possible. So to find real people and kind of communicate their life story, but also communicate their relationship to what they do, their work.
Yeah.
Um, and then finally, also, of course, communicate the impact that this technology has on regular people. I think that is my through and through in my journalistic career. I think that has been my quest. Every time I start a story or a book, my first thing is who can I find who I can kind of write about? Which person can I write
Hmm.
about? And through them
Ah.
tell the story that is needs to be communicated.
Thank you very much, Samanth, for your time on the podcast, and congratulations yet again. And we look forward for an edition of this book along with other writing, is what you said just before this podcast in India, which is due in July. Is that right?
Yeah, so early July, The Web Beneath the Waves, which is quite a slim book, as you noticed. It will be part of a larger collection of my nonfiction. The other parts of the book will all be pieces that I've published over the years. But in the Indian market, most of them will probably be new, and certainly the book will be new. It hasn't been out in India before. So we'll put out a big fat book, and that will come out in early July. So if you're listening to this then or around that time, please do order or pre-order. I'm sure you'll enjoy reading it.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Samanth, for your time on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Abhishek. Thank you. It's been such a pleasure.